Hey guys, so I guess this is how it begins. Um, I've been having a lot of fun recently, just plotting through different places, different strategies for all the weird things that I want to do. I mean, not to say it's guaranteed or anything, but the odds seem to bode well for a lot of my work. Um, I don't know, just time and sweat equity, I guess, and the beauty of intellectual property being that, things can work out in your favor very often, just because, it's sort of a cumulative effect, so to speak. Now, let's see if we can get this system stable. I got a new green screen, so the picture quality should be improving. I hope it translates well, because I don't know, I like it. Though I still rather prefer it being a bit more anonymous. I'm not the biggest fan of having my face plastered everywhere. But what can I say? Faces, they're important. It helps us share ourselves more effectively. If you're wondering why I'm looking that way, it's because my camera is not attached to my computer directly. But I'm enjoying this. When I'm looking straight off, I'm looking at the effect that you guys are looking at. So, these are sort of like meditations for me as well. I enjoy the work. What can I say? So this week I wanted to talk about a few things. Right? Like, I've always got aliens on the brain. But lately, it's been at a more societal level that I've been kind of stuck at, so to speak. Right? So this idea of, I think it's called the Peter Principle, this idea of people being promoted to their level of incompetence, right? Because you do well at a job, you get promoted. You do well at a job, you get promoted, and eventually you'll be promoted to a point where you're no longer good at your job, but you can't be demoted, or at least people don't want to be demoted. People don't want to demote. They'd rather just fire you at that point. But then you've already worked your way up that company. You're clearly an ideal employee. So it creates a system of failing hierarchies, because it's just a poorly thought out system, or it's not really thought out at all. It's just hierarchies forming themselves as people live their lives and ascend. And then with this came this idea of the word isn't kleptocracy. It's it's a offshoot of this idea of being promoted to your level of incompetence. It's what happens when you have dictators and company founders and CEOs and people at the top of hierarchies that are too afraid of being replaced by competent people, that they don't let competent people do their work. They don't employ the competent people. They don't want them there because it's a direct threat to what they perceive as their power, right? And, it creates hierarchies of increasing incompetence, and then once the competent leader dies, quits or gets fired or whatever, must retire due to a scandal in this day and age. There's a lot of shuffling beneath, and usually it's not the best person that gets the job. It's the person that, greased the most palms, kissed the most ass, said what wanted to be said rather than what needed to be said. instead of what people wanted to hear, rather. But then how does that bode for society at large if there's a goal in mind, right? Progress. And one of the frightening things about this idea, too, is that I was watching this documentary earlier this week about building, how do you describe them? Dams, or just structures in general, but particularly water structures. You know, dams, canals, aqueducts. And comparing modern construction to ancient Roman construction, right? And the different advantages one bodes over the other, right? Like, for instance, the Romans would build using materials locally sourced, you know, to wherever the aqueduct was going through, so they didn't have to deal with moving massive tons of stone over, you know, thousands of miles or hundreds of miles, or however long these aqueducts have been. They had slave labor, so that saves on costs tremendously, and they were using volcanic ash, which was reactive to water, set harder, and it's part of why Roman construction lasts as well as it does to this day. And then comparing that to modern construction methods, where we move material, we pay our workers, we plan for cost-benefit analyses to minimize the costs, and then there's the whole layer of red tape on top of every single project, right? So with that, you get this issue of, I think there was this comparison of a Nevada water project that took literally 20 years to complete, right? And it's this sort of problem. It's hard to even classify it as a problem when it's really like a feature of the system, whereby we insist on creating with approvals and like county layers and layers of bureaucracy, essentially, to get any project done. And it gets in the way. I mean, some ways it's supposed to help us, make better decisions, but it's the same sorts of bureaucracy that make us less efficient as a culture. Right? This isn't even to say that it's one of those things, because one of the other benefits of the Roman system, I mean, they were a violent, savage people, just to say. I mean, that's what happens when you have an imperial force roving over the land, and then, well, not even the imperial, this is in the days of the Republic, and then later on in the days of the Emperor, right? So, in the days of the Republic of Rome, there was still a level of this cost-benefit, make things as cheaply and as effectively as possible. But then in the days of the emperors, cost wasn't as much of an issue, but again, you have this issue of emperors not wanting to be replaced by more competent people. So the Republic failed because of the bureaucracy that set it up and made it inefficient. So eventually a strong man took over. And again, the same effect winds its way through the imperial court, generation after generation of less competent rulers, eventually destroying the culture from within. And it's interesting seeing like modern corollaries to this. We just had Trump, right? He's seen as, a strong man trying to become a despot like full on tyrant of the nation, while at the same time we have the next regime come in, and it's it's a puzzling dilemma where effective bureaucracy does lead to better organization, more effective decision making, but too large and like there's a golden ratio of bureaucracy, and I guess this is one of those things that math would help, just calculating exactly the number of people that you need to get a nation to run well. But it's gonna be fun. Like, I say it's going to be fun as sort of a cynical, like, I guess, stratagem to accepting what I see as a slow but steady sort of either collapse or redemption of modern society. And it's one of those uncomfortable things that I don't want to be thinking about, but it's like just me being the way I am, I have to. Like, I have to think about the hard things. And because of that, it helps me plan, it helps me get over him. And at the same time, I'm then in a better position to deal with the consequences of something like that. But it's a twofold challenge, because there's the mental level, like knowing you're in a civilization in decline, right? Because one of the things that happened with the idea of Rome is that there was this idea of the way of the elders, right? The Roman ideal of what it meant to be a Roman. Right? It was 8 essential traits, essentially like what do you call it? Like manliness. These are rough translations, but effectively like manliness, truthfulness, uprightness, honesty. What is it? Faith to the gods. Ceremonial like propriety, thriftiness to a point, and you know, sort of the generic ideas of what it means to be a decent person. Like every culture has pretty much the same thing. It's the eightfold path for the Buddhists too, and I find that like corollary kind of hilarious, just because it's a right speech, right action, right thought, right emotion, right belief, these sorts of things, right? Right? And that dialogue of what it means to do the right thing versus just doing what one wants to do and having the impact spread over society. And then it gets even more messy, because I think I mentioned this in one of my past videos about this idea of Buddhism being a religion or a faith or belief system very well suited for combat situations, or rather small protected hamlets, isolated groups of people that need to get along well, and then eventually defend against outside invaders. Like that's what Buddhism works very well for. That's probably why it didn't succeed too well in India, because there's a lot of diversity and they're not defending as much inward. They're not like the subcontinent, yes, as a whole is well defended from the north and from the south, Himalayas, but once you're within the Indian subcontinent, there's a plethora of biomes and environments that allow for different cultures to emerge and then competing ideas. So once Buddhism left India, got into China, and it met Taoism, becomes Chan, which then becomes Zen in Japan. And the nice thing about China is that it's a lot of flat land, or not all of China. Like, there's definitely mountainous regions to the west of China, yes. But eastern China is mostly flat land, easy to run horses through, which is why the Mongolians did so well, just because, flat land, and they're from the steppes, so higher altitude, so they can function better at lower altitudes where the oxygen concentration is a bit higher. And ditto their horses, yada yada yada, whatever. So this idea of the cycles of civilization, right, and how to mitigate the worst of a fall and plan for the best possible re-rise, because it's one of these things that I also loved about this Foundation series I read as a kid. Like, the galactic civilization as a whole is collapsing, and they have to set up a new planet for human life to survive, but also human civilization to survive well. And I have a feeling, I don't know, my worst feeling is that something similar may need to happen for Western society, just an isolated enclave somewhere. I mean, we still have mass communications and all this, so the idea of these things being cut off is kind of alien to modern thinking, but I mean, it only takes one gamma ray burst, or sorry, not gamma ray burst, that's the least of our concerns, really. Solar flare event, coronal mass ejection, earthquakes big enough to snap international cables, though we have ways of communicating using the satellite infrastructure, but again, like, I see modern civilization much more like a house of cards than a building, which makes me a bit pessimistic, but that's all I can really say about it. Like, it's just my honest opinion about it. Like, my honest emotions, really. Though, I mean, part of the issue is that even with something like coronavirus, right, it was something we created, not even like out of a lab, just because of population densities. Even the 1917 flu epidemic, that was caused by World War I and the aftermath of the war. Soldiers going back home, they've been in disgusting conditions for how many months, their immune system's already compromised, they're coming home and spreading diseases. So yeah, it creates a mess. Oh man. But I don't know. I do value much of what we have in terms of entertainment, but even like today, I kind of just watch certain things because I feel like it's a habit too. It's just something to do. I wouldn't call them like particularly enjoyable at this point. And it's not that I'm depressed, because I do find joy. Like, I was reading this book, The Joy of Numbering, or Figuring, The Joys of Numbers or Calculation. I should remember names better, but it's an Indian author. She wrote this book about figuring the joys of numbers. Yes, that's the title. Just about mathematics in general, and I'm only 32 pages in, and it's a joy to read. It's all about these little tricks for doing math in your head, and I implemented some, known about a bunch of them, but it's great to see, like, this is somebody late in her career writing this book. I'm relatively early in mine, so it's kind of fascinating watching how a mind like that works. And it's admirable. And, it's passing on a legacy. So this is another thing, right, that happens with civilizations. As they rise and fall, they rise elsewhere. So Rome didn't fall all at once, for instance, right? Rome, the city, fell, but by the the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire stayed strong for much longer. Another, let's say, 300 to 600 years, depending on who you ask. Eventually becoming the Ottomans and Syria and Turkey, and it's calling collapse any one moment is so disingenuous to the complexity of what needs to happen to make it happen. But once you have a global civilization, where does civilization go to survive once a global civilization falls? And I touched on this a little bit in my last video on alien warfare, where I come to this topic quite a bit. This idea of breakaway civilizations, and the reasons why you need to break away, just the biological imperative in a way, much more subtle than just basic reproduction, but it's seen in all animals to an extent. Moving to new environments where resources may be more scarce, but there's far less competition. And when you're competing against nature itself or rather entropy, in its goals to eradicate you, what do you do about that, right? You fight it. Like, that's all you can do. You run, you hide, you build, And I find that kind of a joy in and of itself. The joys of building new systems, the joys of creating new things, and I feel like that's part of the human spirit. But it comes a necessary challenge of building it right. So in this documentary, right, they're talking about why we have modern construction projects that need repairing every 5 to 10 years, whereas Roman architecture will last hundreds to thousands of years. Because, one, the material quality was better. Two, just because they weren't planning on repairing, they didn't have an infrastructure to monitor everything. But again, you save so much more money by building well from the beginning that you don't have to suck dry the state's coffers to maintain a system like that. And even the Roman aqueduct system probably, in its way, contributed to the collapse of Rome, because once the city was watered well and there was no more empire to build, so to speak, right? You can only expand so much until you reach land that is unsuitable for conquest, and the people that you've conquered, having been Romanized, right, now have grudges against the state that, took them away from their land and comfortable lives and set them up for, one, slavery, to build the very systems that they will then plunder. So the same sort of worry, bodes on me with society at large, right? Because as it's being set up, it's the youth that are being plundered for the good of the elderly. I mean, though this to an extent has been a common trope throughout all of human history, never has the imbalance been so worrisome because of new technology, right? The rate of technological advancement has made it so that young people have a, let's say, marked market edge over the elders, even though, they have resources. So this creates an imbalance in society at large, where the Visigoths are in your own home already, right? The people that would call for the fall of civilization are there. There's no invading force. You gave birth to them. We gave birth to them. We are them, right? And, the question becomes, do you want to do the things that maintain the society as a whole? And very often the answer is yes, but to a point. there's only so much of standard bureaucracy people are looking to deal with. There's only so much of there's only so much bullshit people take before they, I don't want to say snap, but effectively go their own way. I mean, this is what happens with Breakaway Civilizations. They go their own way, and even now we have this idea of MGTOW, men going their own way, and like the idea behind that is that I've probably touched on this before. It's men eschewing romantic relationships in favor of professional, social, spiritual, yada yada advancement, and eventually, like the idea becomes that if they want to have children, they leave the country, they leave the West, go, you know, to poor nations to reproduce, which feeds this whole like predatory sex tourism practice, and it's not a good way to raise quality people because your children don't know you culturally, you don't know them culturally. Your wife, you're the mother of your child. There's it's a messy dynamic and it's predatory and is eventually going to create a collapse. It's unsustainable, as the modern parlance would be for the goody two shoes amongst us. So how do you deal with this, right? Because I mean, part of the idea is that humanity's already overcrowded to begin with, right? The planet's overcrowded. There's too many of us, so to speak. But it's not even that there's too many of us, it's the way that some of us use resources. And again, this is one of those things that it's like the 1%, and then there's the 1% of the 1%. And those sorts of dynamics become challenges that we gotta all face. Because, people with a private jet use exponentially more resources than somebody burning a coal oven to heat their food. Like, whereas modern American versus a modern Cambodian, right? 10 times more resources versus an African, maybe even up to 100 times more resources, even though they're using less green tech. And even if the population grows, it's in poverty, the use of resources are so much lower that it's still more sustainable, but it's ultimately not sustainable just at the rate of human population growth. And the moment we reach carrying capacity for a given environment, if we don't figure out better ways to extract resources, grow food, water our seed, so to speak, we get mass die-ups. So, like, plotting against the fall of civilization is one of those difficult challenges for me, just because it's just one of those things that I feel I have to do. And I'm not sure I trust the people that claim to be doing it to do the work, just because, again, I'm not sure they're competent anymore. I'm not sure that to get to a position like that, competence was a selecting criteria. So, how do you deal with that? Right? Because, like, one of the infuriating things about hyperconfidence is how difficult it becomes for others to come in to fill those shoes, right? And it's the sort of thing that you don't want to have to deal with, but has to be done in order to keep the machine rolling, right? You need a competent mechanic to fix your car, otherwise eventually you're gonna break something, either the car or you, right? And when you apply that to society at large, and then you have to then figure out where you're going from there. Ugh. It's a mess. But it's our mess. We can fix it very well. And that's kind of one of the joys of my life, to be honest, just figuring out ways around these things. And I love impossible problems, so it's just going to be another one of them. Though, the problem is that solving impossible problems takes focus and time and resources to deal with them. And if you don't have the minds on the issues that matter, they don't get dealt with. And then there's a dual issue, right? If we create more people, but we don't create quality people, what happens there? And this is something that I touched on with the idea of the mantids, right? Or just pre-human civilizations, pre-human, non-human intelligences. Where after the breakaway happens, those left behind are forced to devolve because the environment on Earth wasn't suitable for intelligence, but atavistic competition. Like, only the strongest survive in such great competition. Though technology should, in theory, I know that there's no shortage of energy on this planet, in the stars, etc. But I don't know if there's the willpower and organization necessary to tap into those resources, right? And then it's this issue of, if we're not going to organize well enough, because one of the things that happens with the slave society is that you have fewer wills exercising direct influence, so better decisions could in theory be made if better minds are making them, right? So it's one of the, I guess, fatal flaws of democracy, because it's only as strong as the people. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link, sort of thing. Oh, man. Well, I don't really feel like going much further with this line of reasoning, just because it's a bit depressing. And normally I go for an hour, but, I hope you've enjoyed. I'll probably be doing something more fun soon. Peace.